Welcome to this event. It's lovely to see so many participants, and thank you very much for joining in with our first poll this evening. I think it's really interesting that creativity is the one that seemed largest the whole way through. I think that's a very interesting thing and something that perhaps the speakers will speak about later on. And so a warm welcome to this event. This is one of a series of events that BERA is running in the online environment through the autumn and into the spring. So do look out for other events that will be of interest to you. My name is Mary Beaton. I am chair of the BERA Conference and Events Committee, and I'm going to be chairing the event tonight. We're going to be looking at knowledge, curriculum and pedagogy. And we have 5 presenters for you who will be speaking. And throughout the whole event, there will be opportunities for you to respond to polls, but also please, right from the very beginning, start to put your questions to the presenters, and then I'll be able to choose some of them to discuss with them towards the end of the event. It's very strange, actually, because the online events are fairly new for BERA, and we actually started to plan this one almost 12 months ago. And I think 12 months ago, none of us could have foreseen how the world would have changed so dramatically as it has during the last 6 to 9 months. And particularly the changes that have happened in education. And I think that it's particularly pertinent, and I think this is why we have almost 300 participants registered this evening, that we really think about knowledge, curriculum and pedagogy and the understandings that we have of them in this post-pandemic world. Because much of the discussion around curriculum that I'm seeing in the mainstream media has a very simplistic definition and really doesn't drill down into the relationship between what curriculum is and how it's related to assessment. And I think that's come across even in the last few weeks when there's been these discussions about how to deliver the curriculum in the online environment. So I think that the speakers and the discussion that we can have tonight is really very relevant. So I'm not going to take up lots of time because I want us to get on to our speakers tonight. Our first speaker this evening is Professor Chris Brown. He is Professor in Education and Director of Research at Durham University School of Education. Chris is a strong advocate for evidence-informed pedagogy and has led a number of funded research projects in which he's helped teachers to engage with both academic and practitioner knowledge to find new and innovative ways to improve practice. He has also just written a new book, Educating Tomorrow, Learning in a Post-Pandemic World, another one to add to my reading list, because it's a new book which explores what a future curriculum might look like based on both emerging trends and thinking in the past. So I would like to hand over to Chris now.
Thank you so much. Just waiting for my video to, oh, there we go. Fantastic. Thank you. So actually, just with my brief presentation, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of that work that I've been doing over the lockdown period and kind of over the summertime. And the premise for the work was really that actually we're really now in a kind of pausing space. The pandemic has given us that opportunity to think again about what it is we want from education, what it is we want from a curriculum. It's almost like a blank slate that we can use to kind of move forward. And I wanted to start thinking about, well, how did we get here and where are we going and what might a curriculum look like in that situation? And I kind of did a lot of historical analysis, and I went back and I looked at how the purposes of education have been perceived and how they've changed over time. And I start, as many of us do, in ancient Greece, because that's where democracy is invented. And it was interesting to look at, the role of education in the kind of polis of ancient Athens, and to look at how education became a way to help citizens engage and influence the affairs of the state and ensure that decision-making was effective, and to kind of build their rhetorical skills to help influence what was going on at that point in time. And then I carried on looking kind of through the ages into what may be called the Dark Ages, and to the Carolingian Empire, in which Charles the Great kind of saw education as this way that we can lead Europe out of the Dark Ages and started to really systematize knowledge into what became the Severn liberal arts, so that this could be used by kind of monks to help spread knowledge or knowledge of the Bible at that point. So things like grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, astronomy and music. And then further still into the Renaissance and the kind of move by humanists to use education to ensure that citizens were capable of engaging with civil life and the life of their communities, and to try and persuade people to engage in virtuous and prudent actions through the study of what then became the humanities. So I carried on looking at this and kind of over time and through the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and over to today. And then I wanted to look at the future and what that might hold. And we've kind of touched on creativity, and I think that's really important because there are so many transformational trends happening at the moment. We have artificial intelligence, we have automation, we have the move in Silicon Valley towards what's called transhumanism. So this is the kind of the merging of people with technologies, nanotechnologies, and so on, in order to make people kind of better than human, which is kind of quite scary when you think about it. But also in a kind of future where machines seem to be taking our jobs, where quite feasibly knowledge might be able to be downloaded into our minds rather than taught. What then might the role for both teachers and the curriculum be? But then I wanted to finally merge that with some kind of vision. Where do we want to get to? And I did that by exploring kind of notions of utopia and how these have been set forth through the ages and what they can offer us for society. So I started with Thomas More, who of course kind of coined the phrase utopia, looked at his work, looked at William Morris, looked at more others beside. And really from looking at the past and what we wanted from education, looking at what the future might bring, and looking at kind of what we might consider an ideal state or society to be, I really kind of boiled down what perhaps we want from this post-pandemic curriculum. And it encapsulated, actually I was quite pleased when we were looking at that first poll, encapsulated things such as care for the environment, creativity, because that's of course what sets us apart from machines, that we're able to be creative in a whole variety of ways. A curriculum that helps us tackle post-truth, and I think that's absolutely vital in today's age. One that helps us engage in wise decision making and that helps us stick to those decisions. And of course, achieving well-being, collaboration, and tolerance. So really, from my perspective, thinking about this, I'm really kind of keen to know where we should be going moving forward and whether these kind of themes resonate with everybody else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. It'll take me a couple of minutes because I'm on two screens here, so I'm listening to the presenters but also monitoring. And Chris, just to let you know, because the others will perhaps be aware of this, we've got lots of questions coming in. We've even had Plato's Republic mentioned so far. So I think we're going to have a really good discussion when we've heard from all of the presenters tonight. And thank you all. Please continue to add in those questions and to vote for your favourites. Moving on now, would like to introduce Professor Jerry Chernявsky. Professor Chernявsky runs the doctoral programmes and teaches on initial teacher education courses at the University of East London. Jerry also works very hard for British Educational Research Association. He's a member of council, he chairs the engagement committee, and he is also the lead editor. Many of you will know him through his work as lead editor of our very successful BERA blog. So I would like to hand over to Jerry now.
Great. Can everybody hear me now, I wonder?
We can, Jerry.
Great stuff, thank you. Okay, so just following on from Chris's lovely presentation, questioning what we mean by knowledge and debating its various forms are activities that have dominated the arts, philosophy, theology, and education for millennia. The French philosopher Lyotard, for example, argues that in a postmodern world, knowledge has ceased to be an end in itself as it becomes repackaged and commodified into new forms of knowledge that are somehow compatible with societal and technological change. And while these ideas may very well appear too abstract for some, societal and technological change are exactly what each and every one of us are grappling with as COVID continues to transform the educational landscape in our schools, our homes, our colleges, and our universities. The historic bifurcation between knowledge generated from theory and knowledge generated from practice is one that endures in many policy contexts. But in England, teaching as craft has been portrayed by recent policymakers as an atheoretical act of apprentice-style learning, rather than what many of us believe should be a professional orientation informed by theory, practice, and research. The knowledge content of teacher education must not be reduced simply to the reproduction of certain sets of actions that any teacher can be trained to perform in any phase of education. Such a reduction risks producing a future generation of both teachers and indeed their educators that focuses on the reproduction of techniques artfully displayed by mannequins and versed only in their experiential knowledge and uncritically digested popularized versions of academic educational theory. 45 years ago, Lawrence Stenhouse published his classic text, An Introduction to Curriculum Research and Development. The key message of that text still resonates today. Curriculum development can only work if we put teachers and practitioners at its heart, exploring their own practice through research. But as I say this, I'm all too aware of the fact that many of our teachers, many of you in this audience today, feel disproportionately pressurized to meet targets with stress, low morale, and low retention, just some of the many symptoms of an overburdened education system exacerbated by COVID. A system that leaves little time and energy for many to engage with knowledge production through research. And yet, paradoxically, the growth of academy chains in England has also been accompanied by a renewed interest in school-based practitioner research, accelerated by the growth of research schools, and in many cases backed by the Department for Education. Many of you listening to this will also be aware of the amazing curriculum research carried out by teachers in schools and funded by the British Curriculum Forum. The emergence of new research-related job roles in schools, research leads and research advocates, just two examples, but also the rise of grassroots teacher-led organizations like ResearchEd also raise important questions around the purpose of educational research and who, why, how, and for whom that research is carried out. All too often, beginning teachers are on the receiving end of courses designed to meet governmental expectations of what an outstanding teacher should be, with less emphasis placed on the humanitarian values that attract people into the teaching profession in the first place. It is therefore essential that critical, reflective practitioners have alternative concepts of education at the heart of their emerging professional identities if we are to avoid narrow and conservative concepts of what it means to be a teacher. We need to extend the period of time spent on the training and education of our teachers in all phases of education. We need to encourage student teachers to engage in both research consumption and research production, with the latter more than just a tokenistic nod to action research. Regardless of what age range we are considering today, if there are universal aspects of knowledge in the curriculum that can be applied in all or most educational phases, and I'm not entirely convinced that there are, or indeed there should be, then the aspects of knowledge I would want to see championed are those that cater to emotion, to morality, to care, to criticality, to creativity, and to cultural sensitivity. For it is these ingredients that I believe are crucial when educating all our learners, regardless of their age, regardless of their geographical location. And finally, it is these ingredients that I would hope underpin the professional knowledge, the professional values, and impact in terms of educational research, student learning, and ultimately societal transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. And I think that what you said there really must be resonating with our participants when they put creativity right at the very heart of the first of the polls. Thank you very much. And again, really appreciate the questions that are coming in. There's some really interesting, it's actually going to be hard to choose which ones. So do vote and continue to add those questions. Our next speaker is Lisa Maria Muller. Lisa Maria is the Education Research Manager at the Chartered College of Teaching, where she works linking research and practice. She's responsible for the original research projects that are being undertaken by the college. And most recently, she's co-authored 2 reports on the impact of COVID-19 on students and teachers with her colleague Gemma Goldenberg. And that's what she's going to be talking about tonight. So can I hand the meeting over to Lisa Maria?
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I wanted to take this opportunity today to tell you a little bit about the research that we have carried out at the Chartered College of Teaching. As was mentioned before, we recently published 2 reports. One was a literature review, and the other one was based on a survey and focus groups with our members. Nearly 1,800 of our members responded to an online survey, the results of which we combined with results from online focus groups. And the aim of this was to find out how teachers assess the effects of partial school closures due to COVID-19 on student learning as well as student and teacher well-being. We obviously won't have time to go into details of the results today, but I thought I'd pick out one aspect that I thought would be of particular interest to the audience here today. As in addition to asking teachers about current effects on student learning and their own as well as their students' well-being, we also wanted to find out how and if the crisis had changed teachers' views of education and the curriculum. And more general observations included an appreciation for the resilience of the profession, which had to respond at an unprecedented speed to an ever-evolving situation, and recognition of schools as an essential hub in society, the latter of which was already described in previous research on the role of schools in crisis situations. So we really saw that schools took up that additional role, that role of a hub in this crisis situation. However, there were also a few key points that emerged in relation to the curriculum and teaching that I would like to highlight now. Multiple responses mentioned the need to slow down and strip back the curriculum so that less is covered better. This was particularly the case for the primary school curriculum in the responses. Some teachers felt that time would be better spent getting children deeply secure in the basics rather than racing to cover such a huge volume of content, and that more time should be afforded to a broad range of subjects, including practical activities and life skills, as well as developing attributes and competencies such as independence, problem solving, resilience, and strategies for looking after mental health, which teachers considered vital for the future. And I think we could already see in today's initial poll that many of these aspects were also mentioned by today's audience. So it's quite interesting to see the overlaps there. Teachers in our study also felt that they had instilled, those teachers that had instilled independent learning skills felt that their students could see the benefits during lockdown, while some others expressed the realization of how important it is in future for students to be given time and support to develop time management, planning, and independent learning strategies. Many teachers also felt that while core knowledge was of course important, schools should be afforded more flexibility. And again, flexibility was one aspect that was mentioned in today's poll. And they meant flexibility in what they cover beyond those beyond that core knowledge. In some cases, teachers had been inspired by the learning that parents had led at home, coming to the conclusion that the school curriculum is limiting and reduces the time teachers have to get to know their students well. Some teachers' responses argued that there is a need for a more holistic and child-centered curriculum, which would prepare students more effectively for their lives ahead. However, I think it's equally important to stress that some respondents felt that this crisis had reinforced their belief in the current system and the current curriculum priorities. So it's important that we take all of these views into account. And then I'd like just to highlight that well-being was stressed as an important priority. And again, I think that came through in the initial poll. Teachers highlighted the importance of staff and student well-being and the need to put this at the heart of educational practices and policies. They expressed that they were keen to focus more on mental health with their students when schools reopen, and that this shouldn't be seen as less important than academic attainment. They would like to see student well-being higher on the agenda and recognized as an important part of the educational experience for every child. And responses also indicated that teachers see the arts, play, time with family, pursuing hobbies and interests, but also outdoor learning and exercise as helpful tools in promoting pupil well-being. And that they want to focus on these strategies and rebuilding trusts and relationships with and between students as a priority. And finally, respondents talked about how social contacts and relationships should be at the core of what we're doing in schools. Teachers expressed in their responses that the crisis has shown that schools are as important for children's social development as they are for their educational attainment, and that being part of a school community is beneficial for well-being as well as for learning.
Thank you very much, Lisa Maria. And I think that some of the responses that you've given there to the topic actually are highlighted very much in the questions that are coming through. And thank you also for referring back to the poll from earlier. So we move on now to Professor Mark Priestley. It's good to have a Scot always in all of our events. So Professor Mark Priestley is Professor of Education based at the University of Stirling. His research interests lie at the school curriculum, theory, policy, practice. He's the lead editor of the BERA Curriculum Journal and co-author of Teacher Agency, an Ecological Approach, and lead editor for that curriculum journal. He also has a new book out, Curriculum Making in Europe, Policy and Practice Within and Across Diverse Contexts. And that's going to be published in January 2021. So one to look out for and to also add to your reading lists. So can I hand over now to Mark, please?
Hi, I can't see myself. Start my video. Good, that helps. Hello, hi. Okay, you think I'd be used to using this technology now after 6 months of using it every day, but it doesn't seem to get any easier. Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for coming. It's a great turnout today. Barry mentioned the book on curriculum making, and I've spent most of the lockdown period, actually until August, pulling that together, and it's going to be published in January. By curriculum making, what we're talking about is the social practices that occur when the curriculum is developed across different layers, or more precisely sites of activities within education systems. So that would include the development of policy, the development of support infrastructure, and of course the development of teaching programs and pedagogy. I'm proposing today to focus on one very small aspect of this, which is the selection of content by schools and teachers. And I will make the point here that teachers are essential for curriculum making. There is no such thing as a teacher-proof curriculum. And I would point to Walter Doyle's insight from the 90s that teachers need to be responsible curriculum theorists, because ultimately teaching is about developing the curriculum. So I want to start off really just to think about the idea of knowledge in the curriculum here. Social realism, for all of its faults and critiques, has offered a very powerful critique of the way in which knowledge has apparently been downgraded in modern curricula, and has reaffirmed the importance of knowledge in the face of worldwide curricular policy that has moved towards genericism, a lack of specification of substantive knowledge, and what Michael Young calls technical instrumental curricula framed in the language of so-called progressive education, but actually often far from progressive. And the social realist critique is effectively saying that the curriculum should be about knowledge, and especially knowledge formed in academic disciplines. And I wouldn't disagree with the importance of knowledge, but I would point to other critiques, and particularly critiques of social realism. So, for example, Biester's work, which is grounded in pragmatism, offers a powerful critique of what he calls learnification, that the focus on learning per se is neglecting questions of why we learn and what we learn. And I think this offers an alternative to social realism. Now, according to thinkers like Biester and also Zhongyi Deng, and I would heartily recommend this book by Zhongyi Deng that's just been published, the educational purpose really is what we should be thinking about first and foremost, rather than starting with knowledge or subjects. So according to Deng, disciplinary knowledge is not an end in itself, but an indispensable, powerful recourse or vehicle for the cultivation of human powers, and a means to some larger purposes of education, or what he calls social, cultural, and educational. And Biester talks about the question of purpose as being the most important and fundamental question, because it's only once we've been able to indicate what it is we seek to achieve through our educational activities and endeavours that we can make decisions about the appropriate content that students should engage with. So really, knowledge is not a suitable starting point in my view, but in fact we should be looking at purposes first and foremost. And this has become a hot topic, if you like, because selection of content is now very much a matter of schools. After the 1990s, when content was often heavily prescribed in many parts of the world, now curricula are leaving curriculum development and selection of content open to local contexts. The problem is that selection is also subject to all manner of pressures that can detract from focusing on purposes. So, for example, accountability and performativity demands, pressures to teach to the test, to tick the box, etc., have been really significant. The availability of resources. In many cases, the pressures to be engaging in edutainment, teaching sexy topics, and also I think there's a real issue around the capacity of schools and teachers to make curriculum in terms of both professional knowledge and skills, but also in terms of resources, time, the fact that often teachers are quite isolated. And just to draw on a piece of recent research, my colleague Joe Smith has pointed for the tendency of Scottish history teachers to select content for very instrumental reasons rather than educational reasons. And I want to supply a couple of examples of that. Barbara Ormond, working in New Zealand, has documented how history teachers in Auckland have been teaching the Vietnam War, but failing to mention the American involvement at all, which sounds a little bizarre until you start to look at the reasons why that's happening. It's simply that the assessment criteria do not demand it. So teachers are teaching to the test, and you can't blame schools for doing that. In a similar vein, my colleague Joe Smith at Stirling has documented how history is taught in Scottish secondary schools, and he's found that very few schools teach early modern history. No Reformation, no Enlightenment, no discovery of the New World, no slave trade. The reason why? Well, often it's to do with resources, often it's to do with what's on the syllabus, the exam syllabus next year, and often it's just simply down to what they think that young people are interested in. So topics like the Titanic are often preferred over topics like the Reformation. And I think this takes us really back to this idea of selecting content for educational purpose. Deng talks about social, cultural, and educational purposes. Biester talks about the functions of education as being qualification, socialization, and subjectification. And really, this does say to me very strongly that we need to be engaging with big ideas of what schools are for, and particularly what our local school is for. And asking the question, what knowledge, skills, and attributes does an educated person need in order to thrive in a complex modern society? Democratic values, the ability to spot fake news, what Neil Postman called crap detection. Society, understanding of a political system and structural inequality. skills for the workplace, personal growth, and to finish off, and a nod towards Nell Nodding's work, the pursuit of happiness is important here as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That's really helpful. I do think it does seem as if Nell's work is going to be increasingly important. There seems from so many quarters just now, this idea of that the curriculum should actually lead to flourishing. And I think that's it'll be interesting to see how these things develop over time. So thank you very much. I'm beginning to worry that we're not going to get through all the questions tonight, but we'll move on to our last speaker. Last but not least, our last speaker this afternoon is Professor Dominic Wise. Dominic Wise is our current president, BERA president, but he's also the founding director of the Helen Hamlin Centre for Pedagogy, 0 to 11. And he's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. The main focus of Dominic's research is on curriculum and pedagogy, and his research, for many of us, we know him for the research that he's done around understanding the pedagogy of reading and writing and literacy. He's recently been really busy as he's led the BERA Close to Practice Research Project and was also the editor of the BERA Sage Handbook for Educational Research. So can I now hand over to Dominic for the last presentation before we move on to the questions? Dominic.
Thank you. Hi, well, I'm hoping that you can all hear me and see me. It's wonderful that so many of you are here today. And as Mari said, we thought about this event a long time ago, and I think I was even part of BERA's conference and events committee when some of these ideas were starting up. So it's just brilliant to have the opportunity to speak to you and actually hear the questions which will come after my talk. I want to talk about a particular model of knowledge in the curriculum and then relate this to the teaching of writing, to pupil agency, and finally the role of the teacher, or one of the roles. Knowledge is one of the fundamental elements of curriculum study, and as part of the debates about the knowledge that children should acquire through the curriculum in schools, links are sometimes drawn between knowledge created in universities and what teachers deliver through the subject of the school curriculum. It's interesting to hear Mark just refer to some of the critiques, social realism and so on. And I suppose in a way I'm taking an angle, a critique of my own. Now, Michael Young argued that the difference between university knowledge, which is regarded by some as a particularly high branch of knowledge, the difference between that and the knowledge delivered in school is one of structure and sequencing, not of content. That's a quote from Michael Young. And in that same paper from 2013, he gives an example of physics in secondary school teaching. However, even in that seemingly straightforward example of a subject in universities that also exists in schools, secondary schools to a large degree, the links are not primarily about content. So if we take Yates and Miller's prize-winning research paper in the Curriculum Journal, which Mark currently leads the editing of, they showed that the problem with the depiction of what Michael Young has called powerful knowledge lay in, and I quote, too sharply separating pedagogical concerns from curriculum framework concerns, or in seeing the intellectual role of schools as if it has little to do with subjectivity and identity and social values. Now, given that the examples to illustrate theories of knowledge in the curriculum are more frequently taken from secondary schools, particularly in relation to powerful knowledge, I want to look at some examples that draw first and foremost from teaching in early years and primary school settings. So the fundamental importance of children acquiring literacy is pretty universally accepted. We might call the knowledge required for literacy powerful knowledge. Let's take learning to write. What's the knowledge that children need to write well? First and foremost, all writers need to understand that effective writing requires writers to select specific ideas to communicate to readers. This is not knowledge in the sense of content to be transmitted by teachers. It's knowledge of process, and it includes understanding of creative processes. And I was delighted to see the emphasis on creativity in the first poll that we did. And it's recurred in some ways in all the talks. Oh, and by the way, just in case anybody doubts that children, even as young as 3 years old, seek to communicate ideas in written marks, there's a wealth of evidence showing that they can. Helen Bradford's work, prize-winning work, was a study of even 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and writing. Anyway, from the perspective of university knowledge, we might say that linguistics is a basis for knowledge about writing, and so a possible link with teaching even in the early years. And so it could take us into the debates about language. You know, some people argue that children should learn to write what is called, or what they call, standard English. By the way, that in itself is a disputed term. And this would probably be called powerful knowledge. The learning of grammatical terms would quickly follow as an example of this knowledge. But another interpretation of this perspective of knowledge is it represents ideology. In fact, England's national curriculum that includes a heavy emphasis on traditional grammar can be seen as ideologically biased. And in fact, Mary James's papers from her time acting on the expert committee in the development of England's national curriculum is still available through the BERA website. And what resulted, though, was a heavily knowledge-based curriculum, as I've shown with my colleague Jana Maniukina in a paper in the Curriculum Journal in 2019. Back to writing, though, what the research evidence shows, I detailed this in my book, How Writing Works, is that understanding the processes of writing more than a predetermined set of content knowledge is fundamental to effective writing for all writers across the life course. Writing is a central part of the curriculum in language curricula at national level and classroom level internationally. And given its importance to education, it should fit well with any theory of curriculum. And if there's not a good fit, then this has to cast doubt on the robustness of the theory. Learning to write is supported by the expertise of teachers. It's generally recognised that the skill of the teacher or other educator is to know when to intervene to take learning forward, and crucially when to step back to encourage the child to learn independently. And I'm reminded of some of the things that Jerry was talking about here. We might also remember the seminal work by Wood, Bruner and Ross in 1976, and the balance between teacher control and input and learner agency recommended by Wood et al. Is consistent with Deweyan philosophy that recognises the interplay between the learner's experiences and the teacher's aims. The quote, stepping back by teachers and other educators is crucial and builds on sensitive understanding of children's learning, including taking account of children's learning outside school. The importance of encouraging learner independence to solve problems using their knowledge is a challenge to the idea that there's a body of powerful knowledge in which pupils should be instructed by teachers. And finally, if we think agency is an important part of learning, and if that includes building directly on learners' knowledge acquired in life outside school, then it's difficult to see powerful knowledge as an appropriate theoretical model for curriculum, not least because subjectivity, identity, and social values matter at all levels of education, but also because the links between empirical evidence of what is effective teaching in early years and primary schools levels provides little support for the model.
Thank you, Dominic. That's really helpful. I've been really inspired by all the presentations this afternoon, and it just feels like there's so many ideas going around in my head. But what we're going to do now is we are going to I've chosen a couple of questions that you've posed, and I'm going to pose each of them to 2 members of the panel. We're then going to have a short break from the questions, and we're going to have a 1-minute pitch from one of our delegates who has volunteered to speak for a minute. And we'll get a couple of the panelists to respond to that. And then we can look at some of the other questions. So even as we're hearing the questions, please do continue to pose questions and to vote for different questions if you think that they're ones that we really need to look at this afternoon. So I'm going to start with a really broad question. It's actually quite high up in the rankings, but it's a really broad one. So I think that's quite helpful to get us started to discuss some of the questions that have come up on the basis of the panelists' comments. And this is going to Chris and then to Lisa Maria. And the question is, what does a broad, rich and balanced curriculum mean and actually look like? So it's almost asking you to put your money where your ideas are this afternoon. So can I pass first of all to Chris, and then we'll go to Lisa Maria.
To my mind, a kind of broad, I mean, yes, clearly we've talked about one that's underpinned by knowledge, and I think that's absolutely right. But I think it's one that helps us deliver what we want from society. I think we have to start with that in the top of our minds. I think we have to think, what is it we want our future citizens to be? What do we want them to do? How do we want them to leave school? And I think we have to then work backwards. Clearly, we want people to have a good working knowledge, but I think in the future, that will only be one of many things that we can deliver, not through teachers. I think we're able to deliver it through technology. So I think we want to have a curriculum that just provides the dispositions that our students need to be effective citizens. And I really do think we can link that to many of the different aspects that we were talking about before. So caring for the environment, so kind of championing truth, so championing justice, being an advocate for equity and so on. So I think it's one that can help students achieve those dispositions and enact those dispositions. One that helps them understand. One of the things that I'm really interested in looking at the kind of discourse over the kind of during the lockdown is whether we might ultimately introduce a universal basic income and as a way of helping people kind of overcome periods of lockdown, or to help them retrain as jobs kind of disappear and they move forward. And when we look at things like UBI, ultimately that means that people have more time and more freedom on their hands. And it's really interesting if we look back at kind of historical perspectives, because in the Middle Ages, people used to dream of this kind of fantasy land called Cocaine, in which you could do anything you wished. There was food hanging off trees and kind of wine running through rivers. And, for them, they wanted to kind of enjoy that and kind of live it up in Cocaine. But I guess what we want from people, if they've got more free time, is to be able to use it responsibly, to be able to kind of develop a way of what Aristotle calls the golden mean, not too much, not too little, setting themselves goals, being responsible and so on. So I think for all of those things, for me, that's what the curriculum ultimately needs to be about. Yes, clearly we want people to know stuff, but I think moving forward, the role of the teacher is more going to be of a kind of life guide than anything else.
Absolutely. I would certainly reiterate everything that Chris has mentioned, and possibly add a few things, not to overload curricula, because obviously they already are quite overloaded. But as we're rethinking, I think a broad and balanced curriculum, I personally, from my research perspective, would definitely like to see foreign languages featured quite highly in any curriculum, because I think they do open up many of the opportunities and the issues that we were discussing around globalization and so on. But that aside, just had to pitch that really quickly. I think it is also one that allows teachers some flexibility in choosing what broad and balanced means in their particular context, because that might look a little bit different. While all of the things that Chris mentioned are obviously undoubtedly important as concepts, I think what it then looks like in practice should be down to should leave some flexibility to teachers to make those decisions based on what their students and their context requires. There is that. In addition to that, I think that it needs to feature a development of students into lifelong learners, the skills that are needed in order to keep learning and in order to keep deciding for them what broad and balanced is and how they can develop these additional skills if you going forward and keep developing that knowledge. And certainly one also, and I think clearly from both the polls and the research that I presented, a focus on well-being and how we can improve well-being and maintain students' well-being should certainly also be featured.
Thank you both very much. And that actually segues very nicely into the next question that I've chosen. And this one is actually going to Mark, first of all, and then to Jerry. And it's one that I've chosen because there's a sort of theme coming through one or two of the questions. And it's almost that sort of, we have these aspirations, but also there's an element of reality, and perhaps reality from the pre-COVID world. So first Mark and then Jerry, how do we avoid a top-down approach to curriculum designing? Now, the question actually referred specifically to early years, but I think we could broaden that out to a number of different educational sectors. How do we avoid a top-down approach to curriculum designing? Mark.
Okay, so easy question, and thank you. How do we avoid a top-down? Well, I mean, I don't necessarily see a problem with top-down prescription and regulation. I think there has to be a suitable balance, first of all, between top-down and bottom-up. And the research we've done around teacher agency, for example, suggests very strongly that if there's an absence of regulation, there's also an absence of guidance and resources and of the sort of conceptual resources, ideas that are necessary to make the curriculum. So for me, it's more a question of how we have a suitable balance of top down and bottom up. And we need a clear idea, for example, of what the high level, the macro level regulation should be about. If it's about prescribing in minute detail content, then it's got it wrong. If it's about providing a facilitating framework and a set of guiding principles and a clear steer towards educational purposes at a macro level, and that's really helpful. But I think there's also, and this is something that's come through very, very strongly in our curriculum making book, we're drawing on 9 European case studies, is that teachers in schools can't do it on their own. Otherwise you get a situation where every school is reinventing the wheel. So we've seen very strongly the importance of what we're calling a meso level infrastructure. And this is the sort of roles and resources that exist in between schools and the centre, which exist primarily to support teachers and schools in developing the curriculum. So some examples would include, in Cyprus, the subject counsellors who exist. They're appointed by the government, they're teachers, and they work both with the government to develop curriculum policy, but also work with schools to develop it in practice. We've seen in Ireland the existence of support teams, again, primarily teachers who have come out of the classroom. In other countries like Sweden, we've seen examples of expert teachers. And I think that what we've tended to see in this sort of dichotomy of top down, bottom up is the idea that governments prescribe and teachers do, and there's somehow a suitable balance to be had between those. Whereas if we have a meso level that's powerful, we see this as a whole system effort, and it can provide the resources. It also provides a forum for teachers to come out of school and actually to work with other schools. So it's good professional development for those teachers as well.
Thank you. And Jerry?
It's one of the most straightforward questions, and probably the hardest question on the planet to answer. Reinventing the wheel, Mark, you've just said, and that wheel has been turning pretty much in the same form since the 19th century in many, many countries. And we've made, we attempt to make sort of quite tokenistic changes, I think. You've certainly got, as Stenhouse has said, you've got to involve teachers. Those of you familiar with me will know that I'm a champion of student voice. You've got to listen to what pupils learn. Whether it's top down or bottom up, I think is to a certain extent missing the point. We've got to end this insane dash to a qualification system where everything is geared to getting 16-year-olds to pass exams. We've got to end certainly in England, but in UK, this sort of pervasive class-based distinction between academic subjects and vocational subjects. We've got to end a training system that teaches them, many of our teachers within 36 weeks. So we're not actually equipping teachers. We're not giving our own teachers the criticality that they need in order to engage with their profession and rethink what it might mean in terms of to have a curriculum that means something. I'm thinking back to Lisa Maria's comments about the fact that less is more. We need to go into more in depth. So I think it's not so much, for me, the dilemma is not whether or not it's top down or bottom up. It's equipping teachers. It's equipping students to have a say, a powerful voice in rethinking what is valuable education. And I find myself in a paradoxical situation where I am passionate about training teachers, passionate about a teacher when I was indeed a teacher, but hugely critical of the education system in which I operate in. So that's a clumsy answer, which isn't necessarily addressing the question, but I think top down, bottom up is to a certain extent missing the point. We've got to equip people drastically to rethink the efficacy of the education that we're providing at the moment. Mari, we can't hear you.
Unmute. Thank you. That's really helpful to both of you. I used to think when I actually was a teacher that it felt like sometimes I was long enough in the profession that it was a pendulum and it swung backwards and forwards. And I just needed to know which end of the pendulum, policy was. And I just kind of carried on and did my own thing, kind of in the middle. But not all teachers have that freedom, I think. So I think that's some really interesting responses there. Now we're going to slightly change what we're doing now. I'd like to welcome David Watt from the University of Glasgow, who as a delegate, a participant this evening, has bravely volunteered to come along and do a 1-minute pitch. So I'm going to hand over to David for 1 minute. Marie's going to ring a little bell to let you know when your 1 minute is up, David. And then I'm going to invite 2 of the panelists to respond to you. So I shall hand over to you now, David.
Thank you. Throughout 2020, COVID has exposed underlying inequalities in our education systems across curricula and within assessment. Now its impact asserts the primacy of health and well-being as the responsibility of all in our schools. In 2020, Black Lives Matter's campaign to recognise that racism pervades our social systems, discriminating at institutional and cultural levels, limiting educational outcomes for Black learners. In 2020, UNESCO published its GEM report. Its broad perspective of inclusive education recommended applying universal design principles for flexible, relevant and accessible curriculum, recognising diversity. It rejected a one-size-fits-most curriculum. In our new future, developing towards a universally designed curriculum for all from 3 to 18, balance between the personalised development curriculum and the knowledge-based approach needs to take account and celebrate our diversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Can I, thank you very much for volunteering as well. I'm going to hand over now to Dom and then to Mark to respond to your comments. Dominic, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you very much indeed for the provocation and the your comments. It's really very grateful to you, actually. We're trying some new ideas, so you're helping us immensely. On the topics that you raise, I think one of the things I'd point to straight away is Bira's work on decolonizing the curriculum. And I think members have accessed the special issue in Research Intelligence about this. I think it is tremendously important. The second thing I would say is I refer back to the comments that have been made about listening to learners. Jerry mentioned pupil voice. I've mentioned pupil agency. Someone else was talking about breadth and balance in the curriculum can only really be achieved if you attend to learners. And so for me, I think it's easy for us to say, well, the education system in whatever country addresses pupils' needs. But I think the reality is, and I draw on a fair amount of evidence on this, is pupils are rarely listened to properly. And listening, of course, requires not just hearing, it requires sensitive understanding. So that then the curriculum, if the curriculum genuinely matches the range of pupil needs in a reasonable and democratic way, I think you're much more likely to get an empowering curriculum, one that avoids discriminatory practices better than we do now. And also actually will, in my view, mean that pupils will learn more, that the teaching will be more effective. So those would be my two things that I think of straight away.
Right, well, thank you, David, for an interesting 1 minute pitch. You probably could have had an hour on that quite happily, I'm sure. I'd like to sort of throw myself back and the audience to when I started teaching in 1990. I worked in a school in a predominantly white working class area, a very tough school. I was teaching history, and I remember a deputy head in the school saying, we do not need a race education policy in this school because we don't have any black students in the school. And I think that that's been a prevalent attitude in many schools. But it really ignores the key issue here, and it really relates back as well to Song Yi Deng's work on purposes of education, that they are social, cultural, and educational. We live in multicultural societies, and we really are selling students, pupils, young people short if we do not address issues and develop knowledge around things like structural inequality in society. And that extends to decolonizing the curriculum in terms of ethnicity and race, but it also extends in terms of gender and various other protected characteristics as well. So for me, equalities have to be a key guiding principle at the heart of every curriculum. And the purposes of the curriculum, if they are about educating young people to understand the societies they live in, or if they include that, and also about creating more cohesive and peaceful and democratically driven societies, then I cannot see how you can do that without educating people in the knowledge about society, and that includes uncomfortable topics, I'm afraid.
Mm.
Thank you very much to both of you. David?
I've just mentioned that as well as engaging with learners and listening to learners, I think there's an element about engaging with a community, a broader community outside the classroom around what's involved in curriculum making. Within Scotland, when we started Curriculum for Excellence, there was a consultation that thousands of people involved in some of the basic questions about teaching and learning, and that built up what then became Curriculum for Excellence. And I think the point in the round that Mark was making, perhaps one of the areas we've failed to address, and it was mentioned in the questions, is a socially just curriculum. How do we embed equality education throughout our curriculum and to take account of diversity?
Yeah,
Thank you very
clear
much.
on the involvement of the community, and I would point you to the very interesting work that David Leet and colleagues at Newcastle have done around curriculum making, community curriculum making. There's a big role, I think, for communities there.
Mm.
Thank you very much to all three of you. And interestingly, I think slightly later on, we're going to come on to looking a little bit more, and I'll invite some more of the panelists to speak about that socially just curriculum. So I think that sets up that up really nicely. So thank you very much for joining us, David. Just to get the audience involved again, I'm mindful of the discussion we've just had about hearing voices. I think it's good to hear from all of you for a moment. So I'm going to invite Marie to share another poll with you to respond to, just to see where your thinking is going with this. It'll take Marie a moment or two just to set it up. Marie, as computer has just frozen. Of course it happens that way. That is exactly what happens. As she's quickly getting the poll ready, I've already had a little bit of a moment when my mouse froze. These things only happen when everybody's watching. It's been really interesting. It just feels like there's a movement that wants change just now. So what is most in need of improvement in the primary national curriculum? Please feel free to contribute. And once we have given you a few moments to respond, and there is a little bit of a time lag before the panelists see it, I'm going to ask a couple of the panelists to respond to the words that have come up. I'm going to ask Dominic and Chris, if you wouldn't mind responding in a few moments to the responses from the audience.
Right, thanks very much, Mari. This one, I'm looking at it changing, and it was all sorts of things, and it's still changing, isn't it? Now I can see that assessment is writ very large at the moment, and it seems to have stayed there. I got very interested in the word rigor, and of course this is where single words are difficult, because the point of that one could be people who think, frankly, the primary curriculum in their particular country lacks rigor, or it could be that frankly the national curriculum, for example, in a particular country has not been written with enough rigor, is not based on the research and other evidence that we have to help us form a curriculum. So difficult one. Assessment, well, I think probably I'm going to now focus on England particularly, but it's something that's common in many countries. This is the problem with confusing the purposes of assessment for me. It's about the mistakes that were clearly flagged in 1988 or leading up to 1988 in England, when the Education Reform Act was put in place, the warnings by the TGAT report that you should not confuse holding teachers to account with the assessment of pupils' learning. And so I think we still confuse these. I think it's causing well, the research would suggest it's causing significant problems for pupils. And so I think the particular examples at the moment, of course, I mean, there's been the fiasco over secondary assessments in England, but there is also the long-running criticisms of, for example, trying to baseline through assessment children of 3, 4, 5, you know. I'll stop there.
Thanks. The words disappeared just as I was noting down my thoughts. So but the one that I was looking at was real world learning. I think that's really interesting, because I try and stay away from Twitter, because it just ultimately, ultimately just makes you cross with too many people too often. And so it's not good for your health, I think. But a lot of the debates that seem to occur on Twitter are very much about, they're very false dichotomies, but they're often about this kind of notion of progressivism versus traditionalism, and one thing being about instilling knowledge, and another one about being kind of giving people skills to do what they need in life. And of course, like everything, if there's two opposite ends of a pole, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. And I think it's certainly, to my mind, real world learning. Yes, of course, we need to arm our kids with an understanding of a number of concepts. We need to provide them with knowledge, but we also need to help them understand how to use this knowledge effectively in order to not only help themselves, but also to help others, and to kind of negotiate their way through life. So they're applying concepts, they're able to engage in critical thinking, they're able to engage in research, they're able to interrogate information and make something with it, they're able to take different pieces of knowledge and act creatively. I mean, we talked about creativity at the beginning, and if we think about the different ways that people can be creative, you can either kind of expand on what's already there, you can take two different concepts and put them together and actually see what that new perspectives gives you, or you can do something completely different and completely kind of transformative, and those kind of instances of creativity are rare. But once we've armed kids with knowledge, then we can actually show them how to use this in a whole variety of ways. So yes, clearly the kind of more practical, pragmatic skills, but I think that's when we can get really exciting and start to help our children develop the kind of things that they will need in the 21st century.
Thank you both. That's and you could see the words were still moving even as you were both speaking. So obviously people still contributing. Thank you both very much. We're going to go back to some questions now, and I'm going to try and choose the ones that have been voted for most. The next question is going to go to Jerry and then to Lisa Maria, because I know that Lisa Maria actually has some up-to-date research data that she can speak to this question about. And that's really just following on from David's provocation. What do you think a socially just curriculum will look like in a post-pandemic world? So Jerry, first of all, and then Lisa Maria.
It's one of those questions that you need hours to think of. I mean, to a certain extent, I think my starting point is we need to rethink how we educate our young people in the first place. I think we need to rethink the nature of assessment. I think we need to rethink the relationship between vocational subjects and academic subjects. I think we need to work rapidly to raise the profile of the arts and humanities in subjects. Going back to the days of when I was teaching in Newham, and how we had young teenagers that were being excluded from the classroom, but you could go into a music studio and they were, without necessarily being able to coherently put sentences together, write songs with the most amazing lyrics, and yet the education system in which we were actually assessing them was not necessarily giving them that recognition in the mainstream. I think we've got to end racism and all of the assumptions that we carry with us when we are employing our staff. I think we need to involve young people on interview panels when we are actually accepting trainee teachers into the university. In other words, we have to seriously take on board the notion of voice, and actually, going back to the days of Michael Fielding, actually get those young people to actually inform the ways in which we rethink our classrooms and our teaching. So I think, and these ideas have been written about by scholars and practitioners for the last 50 to 60 years, if not longer. But sometimes we forget about them. And I also know it's very easy to sprout these ideas in front of people in a conference like this. But I'm afraid that if we don't do that, we will be having these same discussions in 50 years' time. And we can't do that until we actually, social justice is a phrase that we often pay lip service to, and the only way that we can embrace it properly, I think, is to rethink and acknowledge that we have fundamental problems in our current education system.
Thanks, Jerry. Wouldn't this be wonderful if in a post-pandemic world we could actually see Michael Fielding's ideas of radical collegiality in action? I think that would be an answer to many of the issues that we've discussed tonight, if we were able to enact that. Over to Lisa Maria now.
So before I just briefly talk about a little bit of the data that we collected as part of the report, I think I'd quite like to take the question beyond the curriculum possibly, and ask ourselves about the teaching force, the teachers and leaders we have in our schools, and discuss or highlight the fact that we really have an issue with a lack of diversity when it comes to teachers and particularly leaders. So thinking about the work by Professor Paul Miller here and others obviously who have highlighted that. And I think we need to think about how we can make the teaching profession and leadership more accessible for a more diverse more diverse people, so that we have teachers and school leaders in schools who are taking decisions, also taking all of these aspects into account. So I think there is a lot of work to be done there, so that we can increase diversity in teaching and school leadership, which will then hopefully also influence curriculum development within schools in a certain way. And in our work, a raised awareness for inequality in vulnerable students actually emerged as one of the results when we asked teachers about things that they were taking away from the crisis and things that they would like to take into account going forward. So respondents reflect, for example, that their experience has actually increased their awareness of inequalities in their student population, how much these inequalities affect learning. They said that they have become more aware of vulnerable students and the specific difficulties that they face, that access to technology or outdoor space and the level of support at home can vary widely between students, and some teachers felt that the current education system exacerbated these inequalities and penalized vulnerable students, which is why they called for a stronger emphasis on prioritizing the most vulnerable pupils, including being more proactive in preparing them for any future crisis by ensuring that the appropriate funding is in place and so on. So I think we probably should make these reflections more explicit and use the momentum if these differences have become indeed more explicit as a result of the crisis. Then hopefully we should use that momentum to act on it and address it in our curricula and in schools and policy work.
Thank you. Really, really helpful. What I've tried to do is choose questions that were either general or also ones that I felt sprang from sort of current topics. So I feel we've been able to look at sort of Black Lives Matter, elements to do with racial injustice, but social inequity that has become so apparent during the pandemic, changes to the curriculum that teachers have had to embrace. And I think another topic that really has resonated with so many people during this time is that idea of climate change and sustainability. And with that in mind, I'm going to ask two questions, and the respondees, and they're going to be Dominic and Chris, can choose between them. So one is about how do we make well-being of the environment as well as of people a more important priority, and linked to that, maintain and extend the creativity and wonder of early years education into that of older children. Or your other option, I'm giving you two options here, is how do we ensure that our pedagogy enables children and young people to see them as agents of change and equip them to fight for a better, more equal world? So I don't know if you want to take one each. I'm just trying to squeeze as many of these questions in as possible.
I quite enjoyed.
Would you like me to say them again?
Well, I quite like the first one. I don't know about you, Dom.
Right, you go for the first one, and Dominic can decide whether he wants to also answer that one or go for the other one. Chris.
So just remember, the first bit was about well-being of self and environment, but there was a second part to it.
Yeah. How do we make well-being of the environment as well as of people a more important priority, and linked to that, maintain and extend the creativity and wonder of early years education into that of older children and young people?
Thank you. So I think the first part is absolutely vital. And I mean, one thing for me, I mean, people who know me, you know, I do bang out on about this a lot. But I'm just flabbergasted by these days the amount of litter that just is all over our streets. You walk around, people just chuck bottles, they just chuck cans all over the place, and I just don't understand why they do it. And in one sense, I can't. I see it as a kind of disconnect between people and nature, a kind of fundamental, you know, misunderstanding that actually we are connected to nature. That if we go for walks, and we go for fantastic walks in the beautiful countryside, that is, you know, nurturing to us, that it gives us well-being, that it kind of helps us spiritually, and that it kind of helps us reconnect. And when we kind of do that, but our minds are completely kind of knocked out of this by just seeing litter, by just seeing kind of, you know, human debris everywhere, that it's, you know, that's actually quite disruptive. One of the things I found is just slightly different, but one of the things I found most depressing after coming out of lockdown was that you would then get caught up in traffic, you know, for a mile-long traffic as people queued up for McDonald's that they did perfectly well without for the last 3 or 4 months. And I just thought, you know, didn't this provide an opportunity for us to kind of rebalance ourselves, to rebalance our kind of understanding of what good health was, understanding of our kind of relationship with nature. So to my mind, this goes back again to thinking about what is our vision for society, what is it we want, and how do we kind of teach children and citizens that actually we've all got a care of responsibility, not only to ourselves, but also to nature, and look at how those two things are connected. And just on the second part of that question, I mean, I think it's, you know, that there was a Dutch writer, and I forget his name now, but he kind of, he was part of the Surrealist movement, I believe, and he was interested in I think he was called Homo Ludens, you know, the kind of someone who plays, someone who gets benefit from playing, someone who kind of taps into the kind of playful side as a way of generating creativity. And I think perhaps that's something that we kind of knock out of children as they enter into school, you know, the benefit, some fun, of exploration, of investigation, of learning through playing. So to answer that second part quickly, I think we should certainly introduce more play into curricula later on, and even as adults as well.
Thank you. And Dominic,
yeah. I think
first or second?
I want to begin on learners as agents of change through pedagogy. Well, I mean, I've been talking about this all night, I think, and I think learner agency is very much the kind of one of the many Cinderellas of the curriculum, if I can put it like that. I think there's a real groundswell again. I think the current future thinking that Chris and others are helping us with is crying out, I think, for a much more principled, rational understanding of learner agency. And I think when you give pupils learner agency, things like the environment and sustainability will naturally bubble to the surface. I mean, I'm going to give a quick example of a school that I've started a bit of work with in Manchester, and they have a genuinely pupil-centered curriculum throughout the school. Nothing like the caricatures that people describe around the 1980s. This is a very modern conception that combines rigor and genuine pupil agency. And just to give one tiny example, one of the things they do is they agree a theme for a period of work, I don't know, let's say half a term. And one of the things the children came up with was inequality is not sporting. Now that's quite a complex, for you know, a primary school class. They've got to agree on a topic that they can all get reasonably excited by, but also the complexity of those ideas in there around sport and obviously the concerns with equality at the moment. However, if that's not guaranteeing that the environmental sustainability will appear sufficiently on the curriculum. So in my view, if any country in the world has a national curriculum which does not pay sufficient attention, explicit attention, to programs of study that tackle and require pupils and teachers to attend to environmental issues and sustainability, then it's not fit for purpose. It's the pressing topic of our time. It could be literally the death of us. And it's shocking that we're just not. Now, England, I'm afraid, the national curriculum in England is such that for many, many reasons, in my view, I'm afraid it's time for another revision, a substantial revision. And certainly one of those things needs to be what is the place of sustainability, etc. And no, it's not just in the geography curriculum.
Thank you very much. I think that's really, I think what's almost coming out tonight is that we're talking about education, we're talking about curriculum, but we're almost being aspirational about what the world will look like. Not just education, but actually the world. And I'm finding that quite inspirational this evening. We have a bit more time. So I think, Marie, I wonder if I could ask you to share another of our polls just now, because I think it'd be quite interesting to hear from the audience. So what would we consider when selecting curricular content? Your responses, please. And I wonder if I could ask this time, if I could ask Mark and Lisa Maria to respond to the audience's comments. Mark, would you like to go first?
Okay, yes, I'm happy to go first. Well, I can see the biggie that's coming up here is relevance, and that seems to me to be a very, very apt observation across the piece here. If we have a look at what's happening in our world today, populism, politicians who can't be trusted, we all know who we're talking about here in the UK, of course, and global climate change, degradation of the environment, the end of the EU with Brexit, and disaster capitalism. These are all hugely complex issues which people struggle to get their heads around. And it seems to me that if we're teaching young people a curriculum which is not relevant, then we are selling them short, to use a phrase I used earlier on. We are not equipping them to operate effectively within that world. So relevance for me is a huge criterion, and that relevance needs to be related back very, very clearly to both the global purposes of education, but also to the sort of local context, which again is coming up very strongly on here. You know, that there is a need, I think, for consideration of a set of national or global principles and purposes of education, but actually schools should have considerable flexibility to tailor those to the local context too. So a few thoughts on that.
Thank you. And Lisa Maria?
And I think that we can only achieve a curriculum that is relevant, that takes the local context into and current issues into account. That is something that requires flexibility in teachers' empowerment, that teachers can take decisions that are right for their context, as I was saying earlier to David. I think that just reiterates that how important it is to give teachers the agency to take, teachers and leaders, of course, to take the decisions that are right for their context, and to empower them with the research evidence so that they can apply it to their classroom, adapt it to their local context, and then it can be decided exactly what's right and relevant, and it will allow them to address current issues, I think.
Thank you very much. We're moving on to one or two questions that I've pulled out that are in direct response to the panelists' presentations. So starting first of all, and I'm going to call on Dominic and Jerry both to comment on this one. Thinking about Dominic's ideas and mapping them to Jerry's, I'm interested in what the panelists might think about the marketized model of education, or of marketized model of knowledge, that seems to prevail. So maybe Dominic first and then Jerry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to interpret this as probably to do with the ways in which certain ideas, some of them explicitly part of national curricula, enable people with commercial interests to exploit those interests. Now, so that's how I would think. That's one of the risks I see in an area that I know about in the teaching of reading. For example, there is now and there has historically been difficulties around particular schemes of work, reading schemes being a classic example, where a curriculum can, to varying degrees, encourage that. And I'm not at all against, the idea of innovation creating new practical solutions to problems, and provided it's a genuinely open and democratic marketplace, that to me is good. However, where the problem rises when there is a somewhat unholy alliance between policymakers, product developers, and statutory documents and instruments. We've seen this very much in North America, for example. It relates back to something Mark was saying about textbook production in many regions of the world, where the textbooks a classic example might be a Western-owned publisher publishing textbooks for an African government, for example, where there are all kinds of issues, obviously, around commercialism, desirability of curriculum texts, and so on.
Thank you. And Jerry? I think Jerry's having some issues with his connection.
Still muted. Oh, he says yeah.
Are you having problems, Jerry?
Yeah, looks like it.
Yeah. I can move on to another question. That's okay. Very frustrating for him, because I know he'll want to answer that one. So one specifically for Chris. Does that mean you think education is almost treated like religion and is too fixed to change and evolve to meet the needs of society in front of us?
Do I think it is too fixed? Sorry.
Does that mean you think education is almost treated like religion and is too fixed to change and evolve to meet the needs of society in front of us?
At the moment, I think it has over time certainly not been treated with like religion. And I think what's interesting is actually after the kind of Industrial Revolution and the kind of the post 1945 changes, how it's become increasingly kind of bolted to skills and the economy is in the kind of in neglect of the other things that education could be in service of. I think clearly education needs to evolve and change over time, and the purposes of it need to evolve and change over time. But I think that it's too powerful and too valuable to be, you know, a kind of left at the whim of kind of 5-year governments. And perhaps we need a kind of more strategic, longer term body that looks at what are the values we're trying to achieve from it. Because I think, you know, it's easy to change, for politicians to try and change education, because the effects of doing so are so long term that they don't have to deal with the kind of implications of what they've done. But actually, you know, when we're thinking about the purposes, the meaning, what we want, I'm suggesting that actually it shouldn't be the kind of, you know, the kind of political football that it often is now, and should be given a bit more kind of due care and attention.
Thank you. And since you're speaking, I'm going to give you another one that I think was directed specifically at yourself, Chris. There has historically been a conflict between theory and practice, e.g. Plato's Republic. How can we overcome this conflict in modern day curriculum?
So I think, I mean, Plato's Republic's an interesting one, and Plato himself, you know, you could see him getting increasingly grumpy as you read through his texts, and he was, you know, ultimately just of the view that people couldn't really look after themselves and needed kind of philosophers to do the job for them. And I think, you know, that's interesting. And I think perhaps if we look and go beyond Plato and look more to Aristotle, and to look at actually how do we develop a way of linking that theory to practice? How do we develop ways of kind of instilling discipline within ourselves, habituating good behavior, kind of moving from this is what it should be for, if only people would do what they're told, to actually helping and providing practical ways for people to understand how to live the best way they can, you know, the kind of their purpose and how to achieve that purpose, then I think that actually that can be beneficial for everybody.
Thank you. And one here I think that I'm going to give to Mark. With COVID highlighting the limitations of the average classroom, what are your thoughts on adopting a more Scottish approach to learning and incorporating an outdoor learning style to the system? It would tie in nicely with blended learning and would be safe to consider in the long term if COVID doesn't go away. So since you're situated in Stirling, I'm going to hand that one to you, Mark.
Okay, well, I work on a campus which I haven't seen for several months, I must say, which is very beautiful and has a lovely outdoor environment for learning. And one of my colleagues, in fact, Greg Mannion, has done a lot of work around outdoor learning and has used the campus quite extensively with student teachers as well. As an outdoor person, I've always been in favour of outdoor education, but I suppose I'm a little bit more sceptical about the idea of taking stuff outside for the sake of taking it outside. And as a teacher of history and also a bit of geography when I was in schools, we used to use the school environment quite considerably, but I think it has to relate back again to what it is you're trying to achieve. Getting people out for the sake of doing it is the same as using computers or ITC for the sake of doing it. And I think all pedagogy has to be carefully framed in terms of what it does, what it achieves, and how it contributes to the sort of development of individuals and learners. So I'm in favour in principle of going outside. I think in Scotland it's not always very practical. The weather can be pretty hideous at times, although I have heard it said that there's no such thing as bad weather, there's only bad clothing. But you know, there has to be a practical limit to that. So I'm not really answering the question, but I suppose what I'm saying is that I think there's always been potential to go outside. I don't see it as a silver bullet for the COVID crisis. I think we have to have a varied approach. And I will say one thing about the COVID crisis is that we still have basically similar or the same purposes of education. We're still wanting to educate people to thrive in complex modern societies. Now, COVID is one particular complexity we're having to deal with. There will be other complexities in the future. So an education that's geared entirely to COVID for me is misplaced.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. I think I'll offer this one to a couple of people. So I'm going to offer it to Dominic and also to Lisa Maria. What does the increase in the continuing of homeschooling tell us about parents? how parents rate what is alternatively on offer, that is school.
After you, Lisa Maria.
Thank you. It's actually quite interesting. I think I'm going to speak a little bit about an interesting debate that is currently going on in France in relation to this. I'm not sure how many people are aware of this, but Emmanuel Macron has presented a new idea to around addressing radicalization in society, and one of the approaches is to make school compulsory from the age of 3, and to essentially boils down to forbidding homeschooling, which has led to quite a lot of backlash in the communities who are indeed homeschooling their children. And I think that's quite interesting, obviously, because there is, on the one hand, there is the Republican, very obviously in France, the idea of l'éducation nationale, creating a cornerstone and a basis, an equal basis for everyone is quite strong. But clearly, on the other hand, as you were saying, some like education is not delivering what we want it to deliver, and maybe is possibly too standardized. So quite interesting debates going on in that space at the moment, I think. In terms, again, I'll refer to a little bit of our research here, is that one of the things that teachers asked for in our survey was an increased collaboration between home and school, and really an increased appreciation also of the things of the learning that can go on at home in addition to school. So undoubtedly they were agreeing that that school education, traditional school education, is important, but that an increased collaboration and link and relationship between home learning and in-school learning would be preferable going forward. And I can think of an example of EAL, for example. So there was a lot of debate around the fact that, of course, children who speak languages other than English at home will fall behind in their English if they're out of school for too long, etc., etc., which doesn't reflect what we actually know from research, that strong home language and literacy skills in the first language are actually beneficial for the development of English. So therefore, there could also be a stronger encouragement and a better collaboration between the home and the school environment, I think.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And Dominic?
Yeah, I think from my point of view, I'll talk about two things that the pandemic we felt we needed to act on in terms of the Helen Hamlin Centre for Pedagogy, which is my research centre. And we felt an acute need that parents would find the idea of homeschooling a real challenge. And by that, I mean all parents, of course, suddenly, yes, in partnership with schools to varying degrees and with teachers, but the parents had to take on considerably more responsibility suddenly. And we did two things. One was we thought about pedagogy and said, if we had to express what pedagogy is in plain terms, what would it look like? And so we articulated 12 principles born out of our research, our theoretical thinking, our experiences, to try and articulate what that is. And it tied into my thinking about, in particular, about some deficit models of parents, children, and these are age-old. The idea that children, for example, cannot learn anything without teachers and schools, or the idea that things have been so bad that the catch-up curriculum will literally save their lives. Well, these are unbalanced opinions of what happens in homes. Of course, it's variable, but I think there's a lot of complexity in traditional models of homeschooling, which are done for reasons often advantaged parents actually who seek to withdraw their children from a state system that they, for whatever reason, disagree with. That's rather different again from what we find ourselves in now, is the new role of parents in the post-pandemic and during the pandemic. And I was struck, it's funny how small individual stories speak so loudly. I remember just catching a news bulletin, and these parents who it appeared were well educated, generally confident from the short extract, and they were just saying, we can't do this. We cannot do this. Almost by implication, we so understand and respect what teachers do with 30 children, you know. And it kind of really touched a chord with me, and I could feel their struggle with it, even though I'm sure they were doing many, many things that were incredibly positive.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I'm just to let some of the audience know, Jerry's having real problems connecting with us. So I'm going to finish off with one question. I'm very aware that I haven't been able to ask all the questions that have been posed, but just to reassure audience that I think that the topics that you've brought up have been really, really interesting. And I think that our plan is that any of the topics that we've discussed tonight, but also the ones that we have not had time to look at, and I think we could carry on discussing this all evening. I think what we'll do is we're going to save them. We're going to take them to the BERA Conference and Events Committee and kind of think around how we can create future events around some of these topics, because these are obviously topics that are important to our members and the participants who have joined us this evening. So I'm going to ask all of the panelists now to put on their cameras, and I'm going to ask, and it's kind of I find that I attend these events and we are really aspirational and we know what we want education to be. I think probably we all have a fairly shared experience of what we want our world to look like. But almost you can feel the world and education slipping back into the old ways of being. So a really quick answer, just as we're coming to the end of this evening, and I'm hoping Jerry will be able to join us as well. I'm going to give you just 30, 45 seconds each. How do we make sure that the aspirations that we've been talking about this evening become reality? I will start with, who will I pick on? Chris, can I start with you first?
Yeah. Sure. I think we need to kickstart a great education debate. I think we need to get stakeholders and others involved and talking and kind of agreeing on the need for change and what that change should look like. I think it's kind of too important to let this just be held at kind of government level at the moment. So I think I would kind of encourage a collective discussion about what we need to do with education and how we should do it.
That would be really good. And a UK-wide one, I think, would be really helpful, not based within policy contexts. Lisa Maria, next.
I would certainly agree with that, and particularly put a focus obviously on the involvement of teachers and students, hearing the voices of the profession, hearing the voices of school leaders, of teachers who are on the ground on a daily basis and who can certainly share their views, and their views should be taken into account, I would suggest. And in addition to that, I wanted to say something else that I now forgot.
And it's just disappeared. Well, I'll tell you what, wave at me if you remember it. I'll go to Mark and I can always come back to you. Mark, you're next.
Okay, Scotland is in the middle of an OECD curriculum review at the moment, which has been very interesting to be involved in. And unfortunately, these things are always characterised in the media as a climb down, a U-turn, humiliating experience for the party in government. What I'd really like to see is the acceptance that ongoing review and systematic periodic review are actually a necessary part of developing a curriculum, and that they don't just involve people coming in from the outside to ask questions, but they involve engagement across the system from policymakers, local authorities, schools, teachers, young people and their families. So that's what I would like to see.
Excellent. Excellent. And it's about hearing people's voices. That is so important. and all stakeholders. I'm looking at Lisa Maria, but the thought has not come. Has it come back? Do you want to come back? Yes, back to Lisa Maria.
Yes, international collaborations and really learning from systems worldwide and at all levels would be an additional one.
Yeah, there's so much in literature about, you know, can you move practice and policy from one context to another? But I think we can certainly learn from those international contexts. And last, Dominic, because Jerry, we've lost Jerry again. So our last panelist, Dominic.
Well, I love the idea of a national conversation. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes, we can.
I also love the idea of periodic review, because I think the party political systems result in extreme movements. And even, I remember in England, the Lib Dem Conservative administration literally cutting down Labour's proposals for a new national curriculum. But if I return to my theme of not just today, but for quite a long part of my career, children's agency, pupils agency, learner agency, there's something practical that I am doing to turn aspiration into reality. So partly because of the difficulties of COVID, we're beginning with an invitation-only seminar, but the purpose of that is to develop the ideas for a physical conference that will happen in Manchester in 2021, probably June, July time. And that will include children themselves, not only inputting in terms of the nature of the conference, but having a voice, literally and practically having a voice at least one part in the conference in relation to their agency and their education.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of our conference, our seminar, and my last task this evening is to thank, first of all, to thank all of the panelists for your presentations and also your thoughtful responses to the audience's questions. I would like to thank David Watt for his provocation. That was a really helpful part of our evening. I'd like to thank the behind the scenes team. You've heard me mention Marie a couple of times this evening, but there are a number of other BERA office staff supporting the panelists and myself this evening to make sure that actually the electronic virtual world is working seamlessly. So I'd like to thank them as well. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you as participants for joining us this evening, for contributing towards the polls, towards contributing your questions. And finally, I would urge you to continue to look out for other events that we'll be hosting through the autumn and into the spring, and join in with those BERA events, because it'd be great to have you along to them. Thank you very much.